Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to a very special edition of L'Chaim here on Shalom TV. It's not every day that one gets a chance to meet, and he's going to hear me say this, I hope it does not embarrass him. It's not every day you get to meet a real, live American hero who has spent decades giving of himself to his country and ultimately having positions of enormous responsibility for the safety and security of the United States of America, and now continues to bring really to the American scene in many, many ways a perspective on international affairs and the relationships between the United States and the Middle East. It is a great honor for me to introduce you to Oliver Buck Revell.
Mark.
And let me tell you a little bit about Buck. He was a Marine. You were a Marine for 8 years?
Active duty for 8 years.
Okay. And then in 1964,
Correct.
Buck left the Marines and joined the FBI. And for 30 years, he was an integral part of FBI operations here in the United States. And he ultimately was the assistant director of the FBI for criminal investigation. He is the recipient of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, which was given to him by the then CIA director. Was it William Webster?
Webster, right.
And it was also given to him by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. There's virtually no event that has happened on the American scene of an explosive nature that Buck has not been involved with since he joined the FBI in '64. And I even want to talk to him about an event that occurred while he was still a Marine. You were a pilot.
That's correct.
And there was an event there that I find fascinating, as he writes about in his wonderful book, which all of you should pick up, A G-Man's Journal, like this, but a beautifully written book, and in many ways spellbinding. You wrote that, Buck, by the way, in 1998.
Correct.
Which I find interesting. Have you written since then?
I have not written books. I've written chapters or sections of other books.
You've got to write more. You've got to write, because events have occurred since 1998, especially 2001, that you should speak to. But in any case, it is an honor for you to sit with me, and I thank you very, very much.
Well, I'm glad to be with you, Mark.
Can we start with your life as a Marine?
Sure.
Okay. And I just want to set the setting that I really want to talk to you about how you view the current situation,
Right.
especially the United States and the Middle East. But I want to begin with an event because it was very important in my own life. You were on the USS Okinawa, a major aircraft carrier, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's correct. Yes.
And you were one of the pilots who was flying reconnaissance missions at that time. And in your book, you describe some of the experiences you had and feelings you had. And I wanted to know if you could simply talk for a moment, if you can remember what it was like in those days when we in America realized that we were on the brink of perhaps nuclear war with the then Soviet Union. And lo and behold, President Kennedy draws a line. You're part of the fleet that is protecting that line. And ultimately, the president said, if you cross that line, we will go to war. And as you write in your book, and of course it's now known in American history, the way it's described, Russia blinked, Khrushchev blinked. Ultimately, the ships that you were monitoring turned around, and we did not go to war. I want to know the extent to which that event in some way, and you were a young man at that point, you were in your early 20s?
I was a first lieutenant, 23 years old.
Okay. So here you are, a Marine pilot, 23 years old. Did that event have impact in terms of who you become as an adult individual who then goes on to play a major role in the FBI. To what extent was that event seminal in any way in your own development?
We anticipated that the Soviets would not back down. They already had their missiles in place.
In Cuba.
In Cuba. They had supplies coming in. Of course, we had earlier the Bay of Pigs, in which the United States foolishly got involved and then stepped out. There had been many other events with Cuba that later came to light. And so there was a real concern that, well, we will threaten, but we won't take action. Those missiles were intermediate range missiles, which would go all the way to Washington, D.C., and obviously incorporate, I was at that time at an air base at Camp Lejeune. My wife and son, at that time one, were there. And so the feeling amongst those of us who were going to be going in against the Russian missile sites is that we wouldn't be coming home. But we wanted to make sure that there was a home left to take care of and that our families would survive and our nation would survive. So it was a situation where it could not have been more dire. We had already loaded the ammunition. We were sitting in the aircraft ready to launch. We knew that the Soviets were ready to repel us if they could. And there were a lot of Marines and airborne and, of course, naval vessels committed. And literally, we were within a trigger pull of launching against the Soviet sites. And the Cubans were trying to, particularly Castro, to get the Russians to strike out at us while we were still on board ship. So we knew that it was the potential of a catastrophic confrontation that could and likely would have led to a global war at which all of our families would have been at risk. So when you're 23 years old and you figure, well, I've got one last mission, I'm going to make it count, and you survive that and then are able to move on to other things, you know that your life is committed to doing those things which make a difference.
Buck, how did you feel when you got the word that the Russian fleet had turned around?
Relief and concern, because Castro was still trying to initiate conflict. So just because the Khrushchev had come back and said, okay, we're going to do a deal, didn't mean that Castro was going to accept it, and he still might launch an attack against facilities, Guantanamo, for instance. One of the things that I did was also flew to Guantanamo and flew surveillance of the Cuban army standing against the regiment of Marines holding the Guantanamo, and figured, well, the Cubans can certainly attack Guantanamo without the Russians if they needed to or wanted to, and that would bring us in full scale. So while it was a great relief, and I had tremendous admiration for President Kennedy for being able to carry it off, because we didn't think the Russians were going to withdraw. We still had concerns that Castro would be able to stir up and start a conflict with us, and that would draw not only the United States but the Soviets into it. So it wasn't over, but it was certainly a tremendous relief for us at the time.
I don't know if you can appreciate this, Buck. This was the life you had chosen. If I'm correct, you were the third generation in your own family. Your grandfather had fought in World War I, and you describe in your book how he was seriously injured with mustard gas in World War I. And then your father had been also in the service.
World War II and
World War
Okinawa.
II. And now you're a Marine. In some way, it's part of who you are, in a way that most average typical American families and most average typical Jewish families that are watching right now. We didn't experience. We didn't have the same background. Our heritage was different. And therefore, the mentality that you had was not the one, I believe, no matter how patriotic somebody is, if they've never been in the type of situation you were in, where you're a professional Marine and you're sitting on a powder keg, most of us can only hear the story with admiration, but we can't understand it. First of all, do you understand how unique it is to have had the experience you have, and most of the civilians among us can only hear this but really can't understand what was in your soul and heart at the time? Do you understand how different you are in that way?
Well, there were a lot of us in
Yes,
that.
there were.
And,
but you understand when I talk about the ordinary civilian. And the reason I say that to you is it is almost beyond our understanding how someone could have the commitment and the dedication where you say to us, I realize that I may not be coming back. And at the same time, there was a sense of relief, you said that, when you realized you were not imminently going to war, and yet you also knew danger continued. But for you, there was something about your background, your grandfather, your father, and you. And I'm now asking you if you can somehow touch it and articulate it. What is the commitment, the dedication that someone who was in your situation as a 23-year-old, and then you've given your life to this country in terms of the FBI service and the work you've done since. Can you at all articulate what it is, where it comes from? Why were you able to have that kind of perspective where you were committed to this, even if it meant you, a new husband and a very new father? You were willing to give your life for this, Buck.
Well, God and country has always been the creed of my family. Actually, it goes back all the way to the Revolutionary War, and even before that, before our ancestors came over and were involved in the French and Indian Wars. So it goes back throughout the history of the country. My two brothers were also in the military. My youngest brother was in Desert Storm as an Army officer. My oldest grandson was in the Army. So there hasn't been a generation in my family during our entire existence in North America that we haven't served our country and been prepared to serve our country, because it is such a unique opportunity to serve the greater good. It's part of who we are, and we don't think about it. It's just part of us. And you know, after I left the Marine Corps and we were having all the problems with the anti-Vietnam uprisings and the weather underground and all of that, well, a lot of these people were my age, and you know, going into to where they were making bombs and blowing up buildings, I was arresting people that were of the same generation and yet had an entirely different take on how our country should move forward. And although I respected people who took a stand and exercised their First Amendment rights, those who chose to step outside the law, engage in essentially rebellion and anarchy, I had no respect for, other than that they were entitled to the protection of the law, and so we pursued them under the law. But I certainly felt like it was a continuation of my service to country to protect the domestic security as well as the international security.
Is the United States of America a unique social experiment?
You know, I think it probably is. You cannot name a nationality or ethnic group that's not represented in the United States. And the vast majority, once they come to the United States, become U.S. citizens. They become Americans. And if you look at the deployment of our forces, even in World War II, we had every race, every ethnic group, every religion that was deployed and facing harm's way on behalf of our nation and the allied countries. Subsequent, we've had other terrible conflicts that we've been a part of, but we have not been in the business of except for one short period of time, collecting colonies, going around, spreading ourselves around the world by force. We conquered Japan and we left Japan except to protect Japan and Korea and Germany and so forth. So I think America is unique in the fact that it has had the ability to control much of the world and has chosen not to do so. Mm-hmm. And yet still has a very important role to play in maintaining a civility between countries. People will argue about different responses, and one of the things that I had to do as I was actually the deputy director in charge of operations at the time, was to bring back the first terrorist to the United States by rendition for trial in the federal courts.
When was that?
That was in 1987, after the passage of the what's called the extraterritorial statutes. You didn't have to be in the United States. If you attacked us in a terrorist act, you could be tried in the United States, and I led that expeditionary force that brought back an individual by the name of Fawaz Yunus that was convicted in the U.S. federal court right down the street here. And that was the first time that we had used federal law to punish terrorists who had never been in the United States but had attacked U.S. citizens.
You know, Buck, very often the common misconception or the common conception, depending on whether you're right or wrong, very often people assume that if someone worked for the FBI and was a Marine and worked against terrorism, that somehow they must be very, very, very far to the right and must in some way have disdain for anything that is even centrist, let alone left. When I read your book, and I read the way you talked about John F. Kennedy, and then the way you talked about Martin Luther King, and in this first meeting you have with Mr. Hoover, Director Hoover, and he starts talking to you about King, you share some of your astonishment at some of the things he was saying to you. And you even reflect in your book, did he understand what Martin Luther King was to this country in 1971? So I want to ask you as bluntly as I can, how far right do you consider yourself to be on the political spectrum?
I would consider myself to be either a Scoop Jackson, Sam Nunn Democrat, or I'm an independent. I've voted both Democrat and Republican. I found myself very closely aligned with people like Sam Nunn and David Boren and Scoop Jackson. On the other hand, also I've had tremendous relationships with the moderate Republicans. I do not. I'm certainly not a right-wing firebrand. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the Bill of Rights. I believe that the FBI and all law enforcement agencies are absolutely bound by the restrictions. And after all, the Bill of Rights was to restrict government's action against its citizens. That's the reason it was there. That is the basic law of the United States. And it was my job to enforce that law, not to disobey it.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you whether this concept of a line that you respected John F. Kennedy for drawing has any implications, should it have any implications for us in the contemporary situation as we are now facing a possible nuclear Iran And what you hear being discussed in the media all the time is, should either Israel or should the United States, in essence, express in some way what John F. Kennedy said to the Russians: you can go this far, but if you go any further, you are in effect declaring war by that state, by that act, and we will respond. So I'm jumping now to the present and asking you, as you look, and by the way, the one thing I should also make sure our audience understands, of all the things you've done, one of the things you're doing now of an extraordinary contribution to the American scene and really the world scene is you are the chairman of the board of MEMRI, which is the Middle East Media Research Institute.
Correct.
And what you're doing is you're monitoring. This is my understanding. You'll add to it if I'm not saying it broadly enough. One of the things MEMRI does is constantly monitor what is being written and said in Arabic and being said in the Arab world, and is making sure it's translated and available for us in the English-speaking world to understand what is being said by those who, be they friend or foe, are expressing themselves about the United States and the West. Do I have MEMRI in general correct?
Yes, MEMRI, we found Yigal Kramon, the president, who I worked with when he was working for the Israeli government. He was the counterterrorism advisor to the prime minister. I was the chief of operations of the FBI and therefore advisor to our cabinet on counterterrorism. We had many issues of similar concern and certainly shared our concerns. The fact of it is that if you don't essentially draw that line in the dirt, if you don't say this far and no farther, then you're continually backing up and resetting the line. There was a situation where I was visiting in Israel, and Yigal arranged for me to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu, who was, at that time, had been prime minister but was out and was leading his party. I had actually met him when he was ambassador in the United Nations. And we were just sitting in the office discussing. I'd been up to Mount Hermon, and we were talking about how you could see, not only the Sea of Galilee, but all the way to Tel Aviv, and how the number of occasions that there had been invasions through that valley and from the Golan Heights. And I'm going to use the vernacular. Bibi asked me, because he called me Buck and I called him Bibi at the time. Now it's Mr. Prime Minister. He says, well, Buck, as a military man, and of course he knew that I was no longer military, but as a former military man, if you were in our position, would you return the Golan Heights and Mount Hermon, even though we've been attacked from there on multiple occasions? And I said, I got formal with him and said, Mr. Former Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, I cannot answer that. That's a political issue. He says, no, no, no. As a military man, man to man, what would you do? And I said, well, I'm former military. I'm also, with a national security agency of the U.S. government. But I'll tell you, as a person, I'm also a Texan, and we've never given back the Alamo. He says, I get your drift.
Okay. You do feel it's important then for the West. I'm now going beyond America. Mm-hmm. This is not necessarily about a White House administration or about a Knesset decision. You feel the West has a right, even a responsibility, to draw a line, correct?
Absolutely.
Has it been drawn?
Well, tacitly, but not emphatically.
You would like it to be more explicit.
I think that, when a group, including the leadership of the country, not only the president, but the head of their government, the theocracy that rules around, and they tell you what their intentions are, and that they want to destroy you, and that they want to create either Armageddon or expand and create again a global ummah for their particular brand of Islam, you're foolish not to believe them. The very first week in 1980, June of 1980, that I was an assistant director. I was promoted to assistant director. That very week, a minister who had come to the United States from Iran in exile after the fall of the Shah by the name of Ali Akbar Tabatabai was assassinated 2 miles from here by a person who was working on behalf of the Iranian Quds Force for the Revolutionary Guard. He was then hurriedly gotten out of the United States before he was identified, and is today an instructor and advisor and propagandist for the Revolutionary Guard, and was one of the trainers for Hezbollah. Well, that goes to show how far back, you know, from the time of the Ayatollah Khomeini's return in '79, and then what happened with our embassy and so forth. Some people, you really have to make it emphatic for them to understand, you go this far and no farther. If you don't, then we will have to do what is necessary to protect our people and our society and way of life. And I think the more equivocal you are, the more latitude you give them, the harder it is to stop. And I think we've seen that with North Korea. We've now reached the point with North Korea where there is reluctance to do anything because it's been determined that they have nuclear weapons. Now, whether they're deployable or not, and so forth. But through 2 administrations, we warned the North Koreans, and yet we let them continue. And now we're at a point where we say, well, we can't do anything unless they strike first. And if they strike first, about a third of South Korea will be obliterated. We can't let that happen with Iran. The Middle East is too volatile to start with, and Iran is a very strong power in that area. And now with the government we have in Iraq and with the allegiance they have with Syria, I think we would have at least a regional war. Mm-hmm. And of course, Israel sits right in the middle and in the most vulnerable possible location. And although I know that Israel would do a tremendous job defending itself and that we would come in, there would be a mass casualties on all sides. So I think it's to everybody's benefit for that line to be there, including the people of Iran, who by and large don't want this either. This is not something that they want.
Am I correct at the moment you are a civilian yourself?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So you at the moment have no responsibility to the government per se?
No.
Buck, why hasn't the government of the United States been willing to draw a red line?
Well, I think that they've tried to be the opposite of George W. Bush, that they felt like he was too emphatic, mm-hmm. too aggressive, mm-hmm. and as you know, President Obama came in and said we're going to do a new deal with the Middle East, with the Arab world, with the Muslim world. And I think that was a legitimate intention on his part. I don't think he realized the duplicity that is there. And we did, because we read it every day in MEMRI and have been reading it every day since 1998.
Did you feel he was being naive?
Yes. And unfortunately, to some extent, some of the people he had in intelligence positions were also.
He had Dennis Ross with him. Mm-hmm. Is Dennis Ross naive?
No.
Why didn't Dennis Ross have the ability to give him the insight if you were inside the inner workings of the White House, you would have given? Why was Dennis Ross there and still there was naivete?
Well, I think Dennis gave strong counsel. And I've talked to him personally maybe 2 years ago, a year ago. We're friends. I know that he gives straightforward advice. I think General Jones was certainly a realist and gave straightforward advice. I think certainly Bob Mueller at the Bureau and the various CIA directors they've had have given advice. But there's still this belief, and it comes out of wanting to change and make a difference, and thinking that, well, we can find somebody to negotiate with. Well, when they start talking about negotiating with the Muslim Brotherhood, they better go back and see the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood and where it has come all the way, and the birth of Hamas and the birth of Al-Qaeda, which came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. You've got to know the history, background, and ideology of these organizations to be able to deal with them. And quit apologizing. We as a society have nothing to apologize for, and I think the American people ought to rear back and say, look, we have sent and spent our blood and gotten nothing out. This bit about going to Iraq for oil is nonsense. We haven't probably gotten a tanker load of oil from Iraq. That was not the issue. Whether we should have been there or not is a different issue.
This was not because Cheney had a connection to Halliburton?
No, of course not. Halliburton had all the work they could do, and they didn't need Iraq. There were other issues there, and you know, frankly, going to Afghanistan was necessary. Going to Iraq, that's still a debatable issue. But that's a personal opinion, by the way. That's not.
This is all personal opinion.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm still concerned. I think Afghanistan is a terrible dilemma. But if we pull out, then what is going to happen to all the people that worked with us, and what's going to happen to the women and the children? And I have very ambivalent feelings about, I'd like for us to leave, but what are the consequences of us leaving? We're not going to leave the Middle East. We can't leave the Middle East. We've got, obviously, in Israel, our closest allies, but we have other allies there too, the Gulf states, and hopefully we'll see Turkey come back into the, at least to the middle, and we just have too much at stake strategically to pull back and say, well, just go and destroy yourselves in the long term, because we're not going to pull you out of it.
Okay. Do you see any evidence now of coming out of the naivete? And I ask that again in terms of the drawing of a line. At the moment, the administration is reluctant to draw a line. You say that it may have come initially from very good intentions, however naive they may have been. Well, we're a good almost 4 years later, and they're still not willing to draw the red line. And you feel the red line should be drawn. And somebody gave an example that there was a line drawn over the Straits of Hormuz, and lo and behold, Iran backed down immediately.
Right.
And Israel's position is, as expressed by the Prime Minister, if you don't draw a red line, you ultimately are going to have a situation where you hope intelligence will tell you early enough that now you must take military action. And Buck, unless I'm wrong, military action doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen strategically overnight or diplomatically overnight. And one of the things, whether the Iraq war was right or wrong, one thing we did see, we saw an attempt in the first Gulf War to create a vast coalition. Some of the criticism against the second Iraq war was that there was no similar size coalition. But coalitions take time to build. So that when we hear a Prime Minister Netanyahu say the line should be drawn now, because at some point it may be literally too late to draw it. I'm asking you for your best instinct here. Why isn't there enough insight within the administration now to say, no, we must draw the red line, as opposed to what I do hear all the time, we will continue to increase the pressure of sanctions, and we're hoping that sanctions will, in fact, change a nuclear program. We know it has effect on the economy. Yes, that we know. Israel's point is, you can affect the economy all you want. It isn't affecting the one thing that's crucial, the nuclear program. So I'm asking you again, why is the line not being drawn now? And as you answer that question, what is your sense of the efficacy of the sanctions or not? But how, your wife is Sharon, 4 children, 6 grandchildren? Okay, so if I was in your kitchen and you were talking to your wife about the frustrations you see from your perspective. Are you frustrated that the United States of America is not drawing a red line now?
I think it's past time. I think
Time.
we need to take these people at their word. They've shown over and over and over again that when they say it, they mean it. They were willing to sacrifice in the war between Iran and Iraq. They sent 500,000 of their own children to clear the minefields. If you're willing to sacrifice a generation of your children for your own ideology and for your concept of what should happen in the future, if you're looking for martyrdom, if you are ready to start Armageddon, you ought to be listened to. And you ought not to be allowed to reach the point where you can inflict that upon the rest of the world. So I don't mean that we should launch attacks. I think you're exactly right. When we sent the strong signal with the Straits of Hormuz, they backed off. I don't think Iran has any real belief that they can defeat the United States. And sure, they can carry out some terrorist acts and they can do this, but that's all survivable. But the fact of it is that if they were ever to launch, then Iran would be destroyed. Hopefully with the minimum number of civilian casualties, but their entire military and industrial complex would be removed. That's a tragedy for them. It's also obviously a tragedy for all of the West, and particularly for Israel and for our armed forces, because we would suffer significant casualties as well. If we make that very definitive, then there is no reason for equivocation. You know, you take that step, then we're going to take the necessary countermeasures. We still have Russia and China propping up Iran with their trade and with any type of action in the UN Security Council being blocked against Iran as well as Syria. So it's not as though the whole world is saying put this there. There is opposition to it. Probably most of the Muslim world would like to see us, the Sunni Muslim world, would like to see us draw that line. Now, I mean, obviously the Shia world is different, but I don't think that they, and particularly the majority of the people now, I think they'd like to have a life where they have hopes and aspirations and are able to live a life that is free from the type of turmoil and conflict that they've had for the past 20 years.
I now want you to answer what the other side tends to say. The alternative view is the United States does not do itself or the world a service by saber rattling. And that in essence, if you draw a red line, you can't draw it unless you are really committed to military action if you're pushed to that red line. And that we have just come out of not one, but two protracted, long, painful, and terribly costly in terms of American blood wars. The American people are tired of it. The idea of going into a new war with Iran, taking military action, is almost unacceptable, unthinkable to the American public. And that the reality is the red line isn't being drawn because the United States is not willing to take the action which the red line portends. And that Buck, whether we like it or not, just like Korea, ultimately developed a nuclear weapon. We know that if Iran does not buckle under the economic sanctions, if it's determined enough, the United States is not going to take military action against Iran. And either Israel will, and most people argue that Israel would if it could. It did in Iraq, it did in Syria, because the reactors were vulnerable. They're not vulnerable in Iran, which is a much larger country, and the reactors and the centrifuges and the whole program is deep underground. If Israel wanted to, all it could do is create chaos of the infrastructure, but it would never knock out the nuclear program. And the reality is, and that people in the White House know it, and people like you know it, that is as difficult as it's going to be for the world to live with a nuclear Iran, it's only a matter of time. There will be a nuclear Iran.
Possibly. Certainly we have a nuclear Pakistan. A.Q. Khan spread the technology to several different countries. He worked with North Korea, and we've come to live with a threat from North Korea. But the difference is that it not only is Iran saying that they are not looking to develop weapons, but they're acting as though they already have them and being very aggressive in their posture vis-a-vis the rest of not just Israel, but the entire Middle East. And so if you cross that line and Iran becomes a nuclear power, what's Saudi Arabia going to do? What's Turkey going to do? What are other countries that have the potential to have nuclear weapons going to do if they see a nuclear armed Iran? Are they not going to say, well, we need to be in a position to protect our interests? Even Egypt, which probably doesn't have at this point the industrial capacity, but ultimately could obtain it. If North Korea can do it, certainly Egypt can. So I think there's a point of diminishing returns for self-preservation of the planet. There has to be a point at which you say this far and no farther. And if you don't have to go to a full all-out war to take out their capabilities, you need to take out their air defense, you need to take out their air force, you need to take out their nuclear sites, and you need to take out the Revolutionary Guard. You need to leave the military and the police and the political apparatus in place and not engage in a land war. The United States can do that. It doesn't want to do it. I hope we never have to do it, but it is not a matter of landing troops and taking a land war into Iran. It's a matter of taking them out of a position to develop and deploy nuclear weapons.
And does the American administration, whether it's Obama or whether it's Romney, have the will to do that?
I don't know.
That's honest, isn't it?
Yeah.
You don't know.
I don't know.
We don't know.
No. And I think that Hillary Clinton has shown herself to be a very tough lady. I know that, for instance, when it came to going into Pakistan without permission of the Pakistanis to have the raid there, that she was standing right there and supported us taking that action.
Are you saying that Hillary Clinton might have whatever it takes to take that action, which at the moment you don't know whether any other major politician on the American scene would have the ability to do?
No, I think Secretary Panetta is a very realistic and tough-minded person.
He's not likely to be president.
No, but I'm not sure that Hillary wants to be president either. But
Right.
that's, I think she may have seen enough of that. But that there are people within the administration that are realists and know that there are very definite issues and consequences
Okay,
if
I
you
want
let
to
it
ask.
go.
All right, I want to ask it a different way. When the President of the United States, and I am not suggesting, it's very important, this is not about pro-Obama or anti-Obama. I happen to believe this goes way beyond whoever is sitting in the White House personally. But when a president gets up in front of the American people, and you have been in positions of extraordinary responsibility, president after president, and there must have been times when you heard a president say something, and you said either to yourself, your wife, or a colleague, he's saying that for public consumption, that's not really ever going to happen the way he says it's going to happen. I'm asking you whether you believe that there is a will within the United States of America that comes from the top, but also knows they're all political animals, Buck, that ultimately there must be some degree of American support for it. Are you saying to me, coming back to I don't know, if you had to put your money on it, where's Buck's money? The United States will literally take the kind of action, not necessarily ground forces. I don't know that it can be contained the way you say it can be contained, but assuming it can.
Oh, well, believe me, it can be.
Okay. Will an American administration and the American people understand why they must take that action, or is the reality of life, the administration, whoever is president, will say what should be said, but ultimately it's not about words. It's about what this country would or would not do militarily. Does the American administration and the American people have the will to do this, which I hear you saying that if you were the advisor, or I guess if you had the ultimate power, you would say yes, as tragic as it is, you would say we cannot let Iran get a nuclear weapon, even if it means the airstrikes that you're saying and taking out this and that and the other thing. But is your instinct, does an American administration and the American people have the will to do it?
I think the American people would have the will to do it if it was properly explained to them.
Properly explained.
That's right. And
has it been yet?
No. And I think that that's part of the problem. And the American public is tired of war. They are tired of seeing. I flew into Washington yesterday, and there were 7 Marine caskets in the belly of the plane that I was flying in.
Afghanistan?
No, these actually, of all things, came all the way back to World War II. It was an aircraft that had been recovered and the crew identified and brought back. But of course, I've been on aircraft where they were coming from Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm frequently at DFW Airport to meet the homecoming Marines, and we have Fort Hood just down the road, so we do a lot with the USO and welcoming them home and helping them. But the American public will do what is necessary if it's properly explained and properly justified. Now, you know, we have both an ultra-right and an ultra-left that will never accept, okay? But 80% of the public is in the middle, a little bit this way or a little bit this way, but when it comes down to making tough decisions, they will do it. They will support it. And if it's explained to them in a way that, unless we want to see the outbreak of a regional war that expands to a global war, we have to intercede at this point. I think they are willing to do it. I know that it's a very tough thing to do. I haven't heard, the debates last night were on the economy, and the only thing said was, that Governor Romney says, I'm going to keep the military at full strength and so forth. We have seen the Obama administration use very aggressive tactics with the drones going into Pakistan and elsewhere that went well beyond what people expected. We've seen them go in after, bin Laden into foreign territory without obviously any notice. So they've done some things to show that when it reaches the point where they believe that the bottom line has been reached, that they're willing to do it. Now, I think that you'd almost have to have a consensus amongst the advisors for President Obama to take that step, that red line has been crossed. But he has said over and over, we cannot allow Iran to become a nuclear nation.
And you think it's more than just words?
Well, I think he knows that when he says it, it carries weight within the administration, within the American public, and certainly globally. And he's also heard, what has been said by Ahmadinejad and all of the theocracy in Iran. We also have the entire situation of the Pakistan and what's happening there and how belligerent they're becoming, and the relationship with India. Are we looking at the potential of a regional outbreak there? We know that Al-Qaeda assisted in the attacks within India. So they're interconnected, and part of the planning for the attacks in India took place in Iran. So you have to look at it as a cancer that has to be contained. And if you can contain it by the use of an isolation process, that's one thing. But if it's going to metastasize and spread throughout the body, then you have to take more drastic measures. And Lord knows anybody who's served in the military doesn't want to see a war. The last people who want to see wars are the people that have served in the military. But that's what they know they're there for.
Mm-hmm. There's been some criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu's going to the United Nations with the drawing of the bomb, which was obviously a caricature that he was using to indicate that there had to be a red line drawn somewhere. But he was saying he wants the West, America and the West, to draw a red line. Was there anything in your mind inappropriate about his doing that?
No. I think the survival of his nation, of his people, the entire essence of his existence and his nation and his people's existence is at stake. I think he had an obligation to point out that there is a progression towards a point of no return.
Mm-hmm. There are those who argue that Israel really can't do this alone. Do you feel Israel has the ability, if they must do it alone, to be successful in literally halting Iran's nuclear program?
I don't think they can do it through conventional arms, and I'm not sure they're ready to turn to nuclear weapons. I just don't believe that their air and submarine forces are sufficient to take it out. They can certainly harm it, delay it, but then Lebanon's going to attack, probably Hamas will be energized, and you're going to have a two-front war, and probably missile strikes coming, from Iran. On the other hand, I don't think Israel would be wise to use a preemptive nuclear strike. That would justify the attack by even those who oppose Iran. So Israel's in a very difficult circumstance. Mm-hmm. And I think it's wise to try and bring the West, and particularly the United States, into the same mental framework that there is an absolute necessity for this red line to be drawn, because once they've crossed it, even if they're not able to launch attacks, they will be in a position to threaten to launch attacks. They'll be in a position to blackmail the West. And when you reach that point, as we've seen in Korea, it becomes almost moot. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, Israel is surrounded by a hostile environment. Now we've seen the Sinai become much more hostile than it was, much more of a threat. On the north with Hezbollah, with Hamas in the southeast, Israel is in a tough neighborhood, and it's got to stand and be prepared to do what's necessary to survive.
One of the things that was upsetting to many in the Jewish community was a recent statement, I believe, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who made some comment to Iran that if Israel did launch any kind of strike against Iran, the Iranians should not assume that America was complicit in any way, and that in no way should Iran take retaliatory steps against American installations or troops. Are you aware of this?
I've heard I haven't read the specific comment, but I've heard discussion of it.
Was that an appropriate thing for an American to say?
I think that's something that should have been left unsaid. We know that if there is an attack launched, they're going to presume that we're behind it in one way or another, even if it's only logistics and navigation satellites, whatever. And we also had the Director of National Intelligence saying that the Muslim Brotherhood was essentially an organization you could work with. Sometimes people in high places don't always exercise good judgment.
I want to come back to your experience in intelligence. One of the things that Netanyahu also said was, as much as he respects American intelligence and Israeli intelligence, it's not that intelligence agencies don't ever make a mistake. And that it's not like the movies where intelligence always knows what's going to happen. Somebody always finds out and somebody saves the situation. That in reality, people do the best they can, but there are no guarantees in the world of intelligence.
That's true.
And one of the things that is always discussed now, and you were now out of the FBI in 2001, but there was nobody warning literally about the attack of 9/11, and the way the way it was presented to the public after the fact was an extraordinary intelligence breakdown, lack of communication between agencies in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. We might come back to that later, but I'm only saying that this represents the reality of the intelligence world as it seems to play out. What Netanyahu is saying is, we can't rely on perfect intelligence to know exactly when it is that Iran is so close to the final stage of uranium enrichment that now we take action, and the line must be drawn to give us time to take whatever action is necessary. My question for you begins with your comments about his analysis of the intelligence community. As someone who has lived this for your professional career, can you talk for a minute about where you feel the strengths and realistic weaknesses are in the world of international intelligence?
Well, obviously the most difficult thing to have in that part of the world are human assets. We have substantial technical assets, satellite, electronic, and so forth. But on the other hand, the potential adversaries have also learned that there is a significant intelligence collection process ongoing. So the ability to penetrate inside of the inner circles with human intelligence is the most critical. And in a country where you don't even have to be guilty to have your head chopped off, that's the most difficult to obtain. The Prime Minister is exactly correct. Neither Mossad or Israeli military intelligence, or the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, British intelligence, MI5, they're not going to know every step, in fact, people inside of the Iranian government are not going to know. So your intelligence is never perfect, never has been, never will be. And to depend on it for your entire existence without any alternative measures available is both naive and I think extremely critical. So one of the things you have to do is do the best you can with your intelligence. Let it drive your policies, but your policies have to take into account the reality that you don't know everything and you never will until something happens.
All right. As we begin to wrap up here, I want to come now to MEMRI specifically. Again, one of the things MEMRI does is monitor what is being said in the Arab world, very often in Arabic, which most of us, including Israelis, do not know. And you try to make this as public as possible. You have an extraordinary mailing list, email list, media list, where incredible numbers of recipients receive information on what's going on. And yet, Buck, I am astonished at how things don't seem to be understood or seen or recorded or penetrate in terms of the difference that sometimes things are said in English and then they're said very differently in Arabic, but the only thing that's quoted is the English and not the Arabic. I want you to speak for a moment from your perspective about this as a problem and how you feel in some way this could be addressed.
Well, let me just make one quote and then I'll speak to it. This is from Thomas Friedman, probably the most renowned columnist and author speaking on these issues today. And he wrote a column, Looking in Your Mirror, very recently, September 18th. And the third paragraph, the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, was founded in 1998 in Washington by Yigal Carmon, a former Israeli government advisor on counterterrorism. Quote, to bridge the language gap between the Middle East and the West by monitoring, translating, studying Arabic, Iranian, Urdu, and Pashtun media, school books, and religious sermons. What I respect about MEMRI is that it translates not only the ugly stuff, but courageously the liberal reformist Arab commentators as well. I asked MEMRI for a sample of the hate-filled video that appeared on Arab Muslim mass media, and here are some, and they go on and list them. We also had within a week the editorial board of the Washington Post, certainly a left-leaning liberal, come out and say, you know, if it weren't for MEMRI, there would be a tremendous information gap in the United States and the Western world. We put out documents to the media, to the congressional committees, to the educational institutions, and to the public at large. Every day there is free access to website and emails sent out that gives the inside information. And when we translate it literally. These are their words. We don't interpret, we don't put our spin on it. No one has ever shown where we manipulated information coming from any of those languages. And our purpose is, and when I came with Yigal and said, okay, but we've got to put the good with the bad. We've got to try and show there, although there's not a balance, we've got to show there is an element that is trying to make things better, and we've got to provide support to them at the same time we point to the ugly side that is predominant. It has really confounded and confused and infuriated the Arab and the greater Muslim media that somebody is keeping track of what they're really saying, not what they're putting in English and giving to us. And if you ever watch Al Jazeera in English and then you watch in Arabic and see a translation, they're not the same. So MEMRI provides a very important thing.
You're doing an enormous service. Right. Now come to the second part of the question. It seems like, although Thomas Friedman, Washington Post, and by the way, it's not like nobody notices what you're doing. There is still a common way in which the Arab world is discussed, and very often the only thing that's quoted is what is said in English. And sometimes it sounds very conciliatory, while from the very same mouth is coming a very different kind of message. And I want to know now from your perspective, to what extent do you feel now there is within the Arab world an attempt to be conciliatory to the State of Israel and to the West, or to the extent to which you see it, are we really still in a situation where the vast majority of Arab, if not Muslim world, still has the attitude that there should be no Zionist entity in the Middle East, and ultimately the West is somehow a satanic force that needs to be destroyed?
Well, unfortunately, the Arab Spring has led to perhaps more negativity than we had even under the old dictatorships that obviously we supported because they were essentially on our side, but we couldn't support against an uprising of the people. But that uprising of the people wasn't organized, and the organizations that came in were like the Muslim Brotherhood and have an agenda. And they have expressed that agenda over and over again. And they repeated it. And one of the first things that Morsi, the Egyptian president, said is, well, we want the blind sheikh back, you know, we want Rahman back. Well, he killed and authorized the killing of multiple Americans, and we can't give him back, and we won't give him back. But that was their first demand. Well, that shows a mindset. I think right now that in spite of our best efforts, in spite of the Israeli efforts, in spite of some efforts coming out of the Middle East, and there are, that we are probably in a worse situation than we have been in the last 20 years. I think Hamas is dominating now, and we're not likely to see any movement towards a Palestinian two-state solution. I think Iran has made it its principal objective is to see Israel erased. I think Egypt is no longer wants to be influenced by the United States, and I'm concerned about the pressure on Jordan. I'm concerned with the drift of Turkey back into the Islamist arena. At the present time, the most dangerous part of the world, and it goes all the way over to Pakistan, is within the Islamic world and their view, the controlling elements' view of what they need to do to fulfill their destiny. And that doesn't include Israel, and it doesn't include the Western domination of the global society.
From your perspective, Buck, how important is Israel to the United States?
Well, you know, would the United States survive if Israel was destroyed? Yes. Would we be gravely wounded and severely harmed? Absolutely. Not just because of our own personal relationships and friendships and so forth, but the science and technology and humanities and medicine and everything that Israel has contributed, which is well beyond the number of people that come from Israel. It has been a very significant factor in the enhancement and improvement of civilization. And I don't think that as a people that we can stand by and let it happen. I certainly will never accept it.
This has been such a pleasure for me. I was looking forward to meeting you in theory.
You're never sure.
I am so thrilled to have been in your presence. I hope you'll let me put a semicolon, not a period here. I want to. There's much more I want to talk to you about. We just don't have time this time. You're on the way to a board meeting. But one of our own board members, Dr. Naomi Vilko, told me that I should talk to you. She was 1,000% correct. You have done extraordinary service to your country, your family, to the state of Israel and the world. And I wish you all the best in everything you do. You are an absolutely precious human being. Thank you for giving us time.
Well, you're very gracious. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much.
My pleasure.
Those are the thoughts of Buck Revell, who is the chairman of the board of MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute. And he spent, of course, 30 years as a member of the FBI and was assistant director of the FBI. And he's done extraordinary work for America and for the world. And what a kick it is for me to be able to present him to you. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything Buck Revell had to say. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. And if you would like to express any thoughts to Buck Revell yourself, email me and I will forward your comments on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.
Shut up!